Okay, welcome. 13 weeks in, uh, and still finding plenty to talk about and still having plenty of questions being raised. So this week, as I mentioned last week, I would cover off leveraging critical events in order to try to achieve the best outcome you can for rent relief during COVID. So that's just the title of that next screen. Today's focus being leveraging critical events. And if we quickly go to the next one straight away, I'll just cover off. This screen was on last week to advise pretty much what we would cover. Leveraging critical events. What is leverage? These are, again, we're only going to rush through this in 15 minutes. So it's fairly high level stuff. Hopefully it raises a few questions that feel free to ask. And at the end we can cover these concepts specific to your situation. So we'll cover off what is leverage, what do you have that can be used as leverage, give you an idea of some of the current tactics during COVID-19 negotiations that have been used by both tenants and landlords. And I have 3 or 4 examples on each side of actual situations that have been used by tenants that I'm aware of or landlords that I'm aware of, whether I've personally been involved in that negotiation or just heard it through people I've spoken with. And then finally, a couple of my top tips to maximising your leverage to get these outcomes. So let's go to the next screen, and it's probably worth initially just recapping on actually what leverage is. And it can be defined as the power that one side has to influence the other side to move closer to their negotiation position. Obviously, negotiation is about achieving the best outcome for your side. Usually at the start of that process, tenant will be down here and the landlord will be up there, and it's about somewhere in the middle. In the last 8-10 years, I think it's been very much going across towards the landlord side. They have more leverage and more power at the negotiating table, and we've certainly seen that start to come back towards the tenant side through COVID-19 and probably going into the post-COVID period. Now, I've also written there a couple of key points is that those with poor leverage have a reduced likelihood of being successful even if they have strong negotiation skills. You can be the best negotiator, but if you've got no leverage, it's very difficult to get the best outcome for your party. And on the other hand, when leverage is abused, and we see this unfortunately all the time on both sides, it can lead to coercion, which results in making decisions you would normally not make if you had free will. And we hear this all the time on the tenant side where they've entered into leases and then later on when performance has not been great and the reality is set in, they are often communicating that they only entered into the lease because they felt they had no choice. They didn't have any power at the negotiating table to get a fair rent or what they wanted to achieve, and that often results. If we go to the next screen, we'll have a look at what I had indicated we would touch on is actually critical events. And by critical events, we're talking about events in your lease cycle. So within the lease, there will be particular events. We call them critical events because they are critical to your business and critical to the cycle of the lease. They represent opportunities to realign rents to market, to alter or vary lease terms or conditions during the course of the lease or at some point in the life cycle. So some of those critical events are things like a lease renewal, and we're relating it back to the COVID pandemic period and the negotiations we're in right now. So lease renewal within the next 6 to 12 months is a critical event in relation to COVID negotiations. If your lease is expired and in holdover, that's an opportunity to negotiate a critical event. And where there's an option term, with or without a market rent review, any form of exercising an option right now over the next 6 to 12 months certainly presents the same leverage again. Other items are also obviously used as leverage, which we're not touching on too greatly. You may well have heard the term quite a bit in the last 12 months from the US, quid pro quo. It's another form of leverage and defined as a favour or advantage granted in return for something. And all of these use of leverage, quid pro quos, etc., are completely normal in negotiating or seeking a result. The problem with all of these things come when the coercion is done in a way that becomes extremely negative. You may recall the impeachment of Donald Trump was all about a quid pro quo, where he sought personal gain through coercion. You start an investigation on this person so it helps my re-election, or I will not give you funding. In many ways, negotiations between landlords and tenants have drifted to that very negative end of the spectrum of negotiating in many cases. So we want to be aware of that. So if I give some specific examples on the next slide where retailers have used leverage during COVID-19, and generally I've seen retailers using something as leverage to get rent relief, and that's different to how landlords have used it. Specific examples are things like, I have 6 stores in holdover and I won't renew those leases unless we achieve proportionate rent relief. I'm not exercising my option term and will decide on negotiating a renewal closer to the expiry after we see how you support us through this pandemic period. Another example is, I'm not reopening our 600 stores until you agree to restructure all of our leases to turnover rent-based leases. That one may sound familiar. Obviously, that's Premier Group and widely appearing in news articles for the past 2 months or so, where Solomon Lew is taking that approach to dealings with some of his major landlords for the group. And the last one is, my family have been in the centre for over 30 years and we stayed open when most shops closed. We've supported the centre, but we need support from the centre as well. That's another form of leverage being used in that negotiation. Whereas if we look at the landlord side and how they've used leverage during this period, generally they're using something as leverage to get rent. They're using rent relief as the leverage to get something else. Whatever is important to that particular landlord. And these are true examples, actual examples that we've heard from landlords. We'll provide 50% waived rent for 3 months on the condition you extend the current lease for 12 months. And we've talked a number of times in the last 12 weeks about why that may not be a good option. Short-term gain for possibly a longer-term pain. Another one, we have to finalise the market rent review before we'll consider rent support. This is one I'm personally negotiating on behalf of a client, and we put a stop to that. Noting, of course, there is an element in the code of conduct which places a freeze on all rent review mechanisms during the pandemic period. So while we can complete the market rent review, it's completely irrelevant because any increase doesn't come into effect until after the pandemic period. So we're able to turn that around and deal with COVID first. Interestingly, that what the landlord was attaching to that was that once they agree the rent going forward, then they'll be able to decide how much support they can provide based on what rent we agree to. Their expectation being that if we agree to a higher rent, they'll be able to provide more support, which obviously doesn't help the tenant in year 2, 3, 4 and 5 of a lease, particularly in a recession period. Another, the first one at the top there as well will provide 50% waived rent for 3 months on the condition you extend. That's one I've wasn't involved in initially and am now, and am actually going to mediation with my client with this landlord on Friday, because that doesn't sound too harsh, but it came with extreme bullying rhetoric around that, and subsequently withdrew any support or any discussion of support because the person would not renew the lease for 12 months as a condition of receiving rental support. So quickly to the third one, we won't discuss rent relief until you reopen the store, and this was obviously a big factor in shopping centres and all the key landlords, and still is. There's about 70 or 80% of shops reopened in shopping centres, and most of the ones that are not reopened are because they're locked in ongoing negotiations with landlords around support for the period that they were closed and continue to be closed. And landlords often taking the approach of refusing to negotiate. I experienced this with one of our portfolio clients in a particular large format retail environment where the landlord would not discuss rent relief until the store had reopened. And the final example there, will provide rent support for the pandemic period as long as you waive your right to any future claim if there's a second wave. So trying to indemnify themselves against any future claims, which would also be considered some form of negative coercion, and not a position you'd like to put your business in, agreeing to something that is quite possibly going to affect us down the track if everyone's quite concerned about what's happening in Victoria at the moment and the potential for recent sort of reopening and re-engaging to be reversed. So we wouldn't like to agree to some things like that prematurely. The next slide. I've just got a couple of tips to maximising leverage. And on this one, I've written to remember Covey's 7 habits. So if you've read some books on leadership in the past, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is a good one to keep in mind. One of the key habits of the book is seek to understand before being understood, and that covers these first 2 points. Understand what the other party values. And for landlords at the moment, and it can vary and be different for different size and types of landlords, whether an institutional investor or a self-managed super fund owner investor, or somewhere in between. it's going to be different. But if you can understand what is important to that landlord, then you have more chance to leverage what you have to get a good result. Some of the things that are important to some of those landlords are WALE, W-A-L-E, that's weighted average of lease expiry. That's why a lot of landlords would like to lock in new long-term leases or new lease terms, or extend existing lease terms to shore up their finance and support from their financiers and so on, and their valuations. Stores being open for trade are obviously very important to shopping centres. They want people to come back to shopping centres, and they want stores open so that when people come, there's shopping for them. Continuity of business. That may be important to some landlords, just getting having businesses that are sustainable and see their way through this and operate beyond COVID and meet their lease obligations for the remainder of the term. Exclusivity is important to a lot of landlords. They like to have retailers that offer something a bit different that other shopping centres don't, so that customers come to their shopping centre. Quality and so on. Some shopping centres are designated as fashion shopping centres, tier 1 shopping centres, etc. So quality is important to them. And then after seeking to understand, then seek to be understood. Effectively communicate what or how what you have satisfies that need that you've or desire from the landlord. If they have a need to extend leases and have a good WALE, then how can you help solve that problem for them? By being willing to enter into a new lease as long as it's on the right terms. And if you have a lease in coming up for expiry, then that is leverage for you. The third one there is just a tip, but also a warning. Don't allow coercion / influence to become blackmail. And when coercion is used in a negative way, it's very close to blackmail or certainly bullying tactics. And this is where it is extremely beneficial to engage a specialist who can effectively communicate the leverage that you have and utilise in negotiations to achieve the best outcome, or to respond to landlords who are using that sort of coercion and bullying tactics. We often hear that term, with appropriate counter responses. And the counter responses may be a reminder of expectations under tenancy legislation, the behaviours bordering on illegalities and so on. So there's ways that we can effectively communicate, and where this does go wrong and does fall into almost bullying and blackmail is where people get very emotionally involved in it and don't start or stop negotiating in a rational, non-emotional way. So it's quite often a very good thing to bring in a specialist who can remove that emotion and deal with the situation on its merits, on numbers, and present that situation in a really effective way. So that is the very high level view of leverage, of critical events, how they're being used at the moment, and some key tips on to consider when you're using those in your discussions. So if we'll go to questions in just a sec, and if we go to the next screen, I'll just cover off what we've got for you next week. A bit of a break from me. school holidays next week, so I have some other commitments, and Rebecca has been good enough to step in for next week. Rebecca Pelling is one of our directors in the project services space, and has been doing a lot of work with tenants on reoccupancy and post-COVID considerations for retail and commercial environments, for social distancing considerations, and all sorts of things like that. In retail, there's lots of considerations, and Rebecca is our expert in that. There might be some really interesting perspectives that she can share with you, and you may have questions, not strictly retail leasing and rent relief based, but a very important part, and it does link to your discussions around rent relief and lease renegotiations, because what Rebecca will cover has to be in the front of your mind when you have those conversations. So it involves what costs you'll be looking at in the post-COVID era, and what you have to build into your conversations around your leasing. So I think that'll be really a good change and very interesting for next week, and we'll come back in 2 weeks looking at some leasing stuff, and might change it up a little bit when we come back and do something quite new and a little different as well. So hopefully you get a lot out of Rebecca's session next week. So we can go to questions, and the last slide there. Feel free to type your questions into the chat feature if you want. As always, there's COVID-19 resources and information available on our website. If you go to that link, please connect with Lpc Cresa on LinkedIn for lots of great information. I've got one screenshot of a really good post there talking about how deep and for how long the recovery may take. There's a great white paper on that. Loads of information if you'd like to keep up to date with what's going on, not just in Australia, but coming from our global resources as well. So that's me. If there are some questions, I'd love to get into those.
And just a reminder, everybody, if you think of something after this session is over and you want to reach out to Kyle, please absolutely feel free to email me your question at marketing@nra.net.au, and they will be passed forward onto Kyle, who can lend his expertise to you. And at the moment, it doesn't seem like we have any questions, Kyle.
I can't believe that. There's got to be questions. Surely somebody has experienced the bullying tactics or the coercion from a landlord, or have a lease expiring and would like to know how to use that.
Okay, so we have Andrea on the line here. It just seems like she's typing out her question. Let's give her a moment.
I'm sure there's questions. People are just shy.
Yeah, who's going to be the first to break the ice? And it's Andrea in this case.
Let's have a look at that chat feature.
Have you seen a particular trend in negotiations, Kyle, besides, like, can you elaborate on some of the examples you've given before, or are there any that you weren't able to cover?
Well, the trend now that the legislation's in place and there's no reason for things not to be going forward, the trend now is that there's a lot of these cases going to mediation. And I've had some conversations this week with a key mediator in New South Wales about some of those situations. And the thing I mentioned about not becoming emotionally charged in these negotiations is probably one of the key points that came out of that conversation with that mediator, and the work that they have to do just to bring it back to the key points of the negotiation and try to remove all of that, where I talk about the intent of the code and the overarching principles that mediator was talking about, the umbrella which the principles sit under, and doing a lot of work with people in mediation to understand those principles and realign their negotiation conversations to those principles.
Okay. All right. So Andrea is still going, probably. We have a question from Teresa. Hello, Kyle. We are in a butcher business in food, and our rate per square metre seems to be a lot higher than the fashion stores and other retailers in comparison. Is this true, and do you know what the indicative rates are for food businesses?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question, actually. In the last 5 years or so, butchers have generally been very highly regarded by landlords. It's one of those categories that landlords definitely want to have, and there are not too many out in the market taking up those spaces. So generally, you can achieve very good leasing terms for a butcher, and there are some butchers doing really good concepts. So if you have a good concept, you really should be able to negotiate very good terms, and you shouldn't be paying higher than specialty retail rates. That's for sure. It's a service almost that landlords are trying to attract and keep in centres. If your butcher particularly is a little bit boutique-y, and there's plenty of those around. Awesome one in Woollahra in New South Wales. P. Augustine, I think it is, in Brisbane, with a couple of great sites. If your product is something like that, it would be extremely desirable. You get very, very good incentives from a landlord and enticed with quite good rates. In fact, one of the major landlords had a fully fitted out butcher and were screaming out for a tenant to come and take it probably 2 years ago. And I don't think that situation has changed too much. So if you're paying very high rent, I'd be concerned about it.
Okay, Teresa. So hopefully that gives you a concrete answer there. It sounds like you're in a good position to negotiate. So we have a question from John, but Andrea has finished her question. So Andrea, will go with you first. Hi, Kyle. We have 3 months left on our lease, and we are currently trying to negotiate using a specialist. Our landlords are still expecting a new lease based on full rent and a 5-year term. We have requested a decrease of rent and a 12-month lease to be available in order to survive and reevaluate after COVID. Do you have any suggestions on leverage options aside from giving notice if negotiations are going to effectively progress?
Yeah, look, that is a difficult situation. It is pretty common with what's happening right now. Landlords, as I've said a number of times, are not quite getting on board with the post-COVID economic outlook, still clinging to historical rents and pre-COVID position of power that they held, and trying to force tenants into renewing on those terms. What I can say is the tenants that will get the best deals are the ones that are prepared to walk away. I wouldn't be issuing a notice of termination or a notice to vacate, but I would be putting a hold on those discussions and telling them you'll go on month to month until the uncertainty around COVID is past, and then you'd be willing to look at lease terms. And it's a pretty crucial 6 months ahead for tenants, of course, but also for landlords to slowly come around to the realities of what that next lease cycle looks like for tenants and for market rents. So it will take a bold approach by a tenant, but the tenant who is prepared to walk away from that deal if necessary is the one that will get the best deal.
Okay.
There's no real other way to convince the landlord right now that if they're set in that way, other than the fact that you won't sign the lease.
Okay. Hopefully, Andrea, you can bring that advice forward to your specialist. And if you need Kyle to elaborate, please pass forward your question on to marketing@nra.net.au, and I will put your question forward to Kyle. And John, we will get to your question now. Kyle, you spoke about getting the info on the landlord to get leverage. In relation to rent relief and landlord requests for tenant financial information, what is your view on asking the landlord for their financial information?
Yeah, look, it does happen. It is happening. The client I mentioned that I have to go to mediation with on Friday has requested that from the landlord, and the mediator has picked that up and asked them to provide relevant information. And that's a situation where the landlord has claimed that they can't meet their full obligations of the code because of their own financial situation, and the code does allow for that, where both parties have to share relevant information, particularly when it relates to financier arrangements, particularly where a landlord is requesting particular documentation from the tenant, and in this case claiming that their financier requires that, and therefore the tenant should have the right to ask the landlord to share that information as well. Where it serves a purpose and it's in good faith to do so, it's a two-way street. So we don't have any problem at all asking for the landlord. It just needs to be asked for appropriately and with a purpose, other than just to be antagonistic, really, which unfortunately has also happened from some tenants demanding landlords provide stuff.
Yes, it certainly is a two-way street. And John, hopefully you now feel more comfortable approaching your landlord for their financial information. Kyle, that seems to be all the questions we have for today.
Okay. Like every week, I think a few more will turn up in the next few days on email, but hopefully there's been a little bit here for people to think of, and it does come down to a bit of due diligence beforehand. Understand what your landlord really needs. At Lpc Cresa, we talk about being the preferred problem solver for our tenants, and really you need to understand what the problem is and then provide a solution for the landlord, and that's your leverage.
Very much so. Well, to Teresa, Andrea and John, we wish you luck with your negotiations going forward, and to everyone else who joined us in this webinar, I'm sure you've found a couple of useful tidbits of information in here, if not the whole thing. Kyle, thank you very much for taking time out today to speak with our audience, and we will see you in a fortnight.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Cheers.
All right. Cheers, everybody. Bye.